Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer, and Happy New Year. It feels a bit late saying that this part of the week, but here we go. We're in 2024, and here's my first weekly wrap-up from... weekly wrap-up, I don't know why that needed some jazz hands, but my first weekly wrap-up from that. So let's get going looking at a few of these books. Largely, I suppose the themes of this week's reading have almost been Ireland and sex, but there we go. Happy combination. But the book that isn't either of those things really is Your Wish Is My Command by Deena Mohamed. And I heard about this because the book was the winner of the Warwick Women in Translation Prize. And I hadn't realised up until the point that I went to kind of go and look up more about it, that it was a graphic novel. And it's a big book here. But absolutely like beautiful art style. And let's find a colour one just so you get kind of a sense of just this really stunning visuals of it. And I just think this is such a beautiful book in so many ways. The core idea behind it is a sort of alternate world, I guess, where essentially this is all set in Egypt, and where essentially wishes are a sort of a real thing, in the sense of you sort of extract wishes like you would, coal or whatever. You mine for wishes, you can then store them in bottles, and there's a whole ritual that goes around, washing your hands with the wish, sort of saying the wish out loud and all those sorts of things. And wishes get sort of are put in levels of sort of concentration. So first degree wishes are these top tier wishes that are the best, the purest, and you go all the way down to sort of third degree, where they are the kind of knockoff ones and things go a bit wrong. Like you say that you want a car, and maybe you'll be given a baby little toy car, those sorts of things where the wish can sort of be a bit more erratic. But at the heart of this is a man who is selling three first order wishes. And we sort of see three different people's lives as they interact with those wishes. And as a result, the book touches on some really beautiful themes, and touches on some really important themes and does so beautifully. So, for example, our first character, Aziza, is poor, is sort of trying to make ends meet as much as she can, is in sort of really perilous situations, and wants to use the wishes to gain some form of freedom. And she's then imprisoned for having a wish and all these sorts of things. And as a result, brings in all these other conversations around the politics of these wishes. And actually, in between each character, there are these little sections that are almost fact sheets of, well, here's the history. So when Britain invaded Egypt and blah, 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 like these sorts of things that then go into the kind of the geopolitics, essentially, behind what would happen if these wishes existed. And then we sort of follow through other characters. So a young person who is sort of essentially struggling with depression and wants at first to sort of wish their way out of depression, but sort of realizes that actually the wider sort of, that's not something that's doable in the book. And so they have to work out other ways of making that happen. And then we get these sort of other characters later who sort of have to sort of deal with the quandary of sort of the morals and the ethics behind using wishes, particularly as it comes up against sort of religious scripture. And so it's just this really interesting set of conversations going on within this book, just around the simple idea of a wish. And I just think it's done so beautifully. It's done with a lot of heart. It's done with a lot of humour. There are so many fascinating sort of things going on in the book. And it's just an absolutely stunning book. So I'm really glad that this is one of my first reads of the year. It's basically, if I'd read it at the end of last year, it would have ended up in my top books of the year. I think it's exceptional. I think this is a really beautiful book in so many ways. I think graphic novels can often do something that sort of more traditional novels can't, where sometimes there's something about the way that they're able to mix and match and sort of play with perspective that I think really just gets to the core of some things really quickly. And I just think it's a really beautifully done book. Next up, on the more Ireland section, I read Megan Nolan's Ordinary Human Failings. And this is the sort of the after effects of essentially some kind of crime. I don't want to spoil too much, but essentially a girl initially goes missing, and then a body is found, and what then sort of sort of follows on from this is a story about a community who at times are sticking together quite comfortably and are sort of saying things like, oh, that family was always really lovely, we whatever, and at times are sort of at each other's throats and are talking about, oh, you can't trust the Greens, they were always like XYZ. And so I think at the heart of this book it really probes this idea of what happens in the aftermath of some kind of crisis. And what we basically start to find is where there are sort of good faith and bad faith actors happening in amongst this. One of the bad faith ones is a journalist who is so obsessed with sort of getting the scoop that he sort of basically tries to befriend some of the people sort of very close to the victim and get more of the story. And he sort of does so by almost posing as a sort of a lover. And it's just this really messy, kind of complicated thing. And so I just thought this was a really interesting book for that, how it deals with sort of secrets and those sort of the ways that some of those family secrets stay hidden for so long and then have these huge impacts on the families around them. And it's really, really, really powerful for that, I think, as well. Keeping within Ireland, I then read Joseph O'Connor's My Father's House. Or I should say I'm still reading. I'm kind of close-ish to the end, but I wanted to include it in this week. And My Father's House, I heard about as well because it was shortlisted for the An Post Irish sort of book awards. And loads of other books on that list were basically from the Booker shortlist and long list. And so this was sort of the one that I hadn't heard of. It was, a book that I just thought sounded really, really interesting. And essentially it's a bit of a sort of thrillery, almost sort of spy novel that is dealing with essentially webs of secrets and lies and what have you in and around Italy, but featuring this sort of cast of characters that are sort of from all over Europe, basically. And basically what we start to see is through BBC transcripts of sort of interviews, through police reports, through various people talking about things, through diaries, all of those sorts of things, we start to see this web of intrigue and lies that's been created. And we start to see how all of those stories come together to make this sort of potential plot to cause some great harm. It's a really interesting book in several ways, and I found out it's the first of a trilogy or of a series at least, so kind of intrigued to see what comes next, particularly as I finish the book, and then I'm guessing it'll now end on some kind of cliffhangery thing, but intrigued to see what the rest of this book does. Keeping the theme of Ireland, I then read Donal Ryan's Strange Flowers, which is a book about, in some ways, similar sort of themes to Ordinary Human Failings, but concerns somebody who is believed to have gone missing and then comes back a few years later. And it then sort of turns into a family drama around all of these things. So I've read one book of Donal Ryan so far, which I loved, which was, now I completely forget the name. It will be in the notes. I've been told that, well, I basically get the sense that he's going to be a writer who I would really love in many, many ways. So I'm going to go back and read a few others of his. But Strange Flowers is just really interesting for the way it sort of builds this big sort of family portrait. Again, like the other two books I've just mentioned, the sort of secrecy and webs of lies that are kind of tied up in everything. And he writes beautifully. There's this sort of deep poetry to the way he constructs sentences. So I'm very excited. I think This Spinning Heart is a book that I've been told is really, really beautiful of his. So I'm very excited to check that one out as well. Next up, I read Permafrost by Eva Baltasar and translated by Julia Sanches. And so this is the book that came, I think, just before Boulder, which was shortlisted for the International Booker last year. And in many ways deals with some of the same themes. There's a lot, particularly around sex, bodily autonomy, identity, particularly identity as it links to the body, and so many other things. But really at the core of it, we're following sort of the quite complicated life of this woman who is sort of surrounded by lots of things in her life that she doesn't quite understand or feels sort of somehow removed from. So people around her are having kids or they are in these sort of relationships. She is a lesbian who is misunderstood by her family. You know, her sister is constantly asking, how do lesbians do it? And, you know, all of these sorts of things. And so her life is just this sort of is sort of permeated by just being this other. And she's sort of constantly walking around just being a little bit out of reach from everybody else and their lives. So she just sort of lives in this very strange environment in many ways. But through the heart, the heart of it, she's sort of struggling to work out exactly who she is and how she operates within that world. And I think it's so interesting because of how her sexuality becomes this core trait in other people's minds, but for her is a sort of relatively benign thing for the most part. She, gets into relationships. They're not always successful relationships. She has sex. It's not all great. She just sort of has this really, this sort of fairly standard life. But there's something about the kind of slightly dry, detached, ironic way that this is written that I found really quite captivating at times. That there's a sort of, not coldness, but a sort of removed nature to it that is really quite interesting. In the same way that Boulder did quite a lot in so few pages, with just this very sort of removed, very sort of subtle thing kind of going on in the background. So I found it really interesting. And last but not least, Weird Fucks by Lynne Tillman, which is a fantastic name for a book. It's a really short book, and in many ways the length of this book was kind of my issue with it, in the sense that it's about 100 pages, but really about 40 pages of this are blank pages or chapter pages where you just sort of turn past them. But essentially it's Lynne herself, well, sort of a narrator, talking about a sort of series of unsuccessful, to call them relationships is maybe pushing it, a sort of series of unsuccessful trysts, I guess. So sometimes, she sort of, there's a sort of laconic tone to this, which I really liked in some parts of the book, where she'll sort of say, yeah, well, I went to Athens, I met this man, we had sex, I went on to Thessaloniki, just this real kind of cool, detached thing to it. I think overall, I don't know, I think I almost needed a little bit more. I think it was so detached at times that I was kind of left really wanting that little bit extra of kind of deeper thoughts around some of those things, or, some kind of other sort of characterization. It sort of felt like it sort of ended there. But the bits there are in this book, I think I still found really interesting, and particularly that cool, detached tone was really interesting in both of these books, actually. I think there's something kind of really fun about a narrator who almost doesn't care about you as a reader. And yeah, but then that's my only real criticism, I guess, is that I kind of just needed this book to go a bit further and do a bit more personally. But I can imagine for some people there's something, I can imagine people liking this for how short and kind of clipped it was in some ways as well. But anyway, those are the books that I read this week. I hope your reading is going well so far this year. Take care, and let's hope it's a good 2024. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.